Hello out there in law school land. This is Jonathan Lipson, and this is The Real Deal on Contracts. Today we'll introduce remedies for the breach of contract. If you're in my contracts class, this will be Unit 1.2. We're going to just focus on three issues over the next few minutes. Number one, what are remedies? Number two, what remedies are available for the breach of contract? And number three, why remedies? Why are we starting with these things at all? Number one, what are remedies? Essentially, a remedy is what a court can do to try to solve a legal problem. In the case of a breach of contract, usually this means an award of money damages. So the term you'll see most frequently is damages, and that simply means a dollar amount that a court has said the breacher has to pay to the non-breacher. Sometimes, not so often, but sometimes a court will actually order somebody to do something specifically. That's called specific performance, and we'll come to that in a week or two. An alternative to either of those is that a court may, in other cases, order somebody to stop doing something. That's called an injunction, and we really don't spend too much time on those a little bit in this class. You spend more time in other classes talking about injunctions. So what's a remedy? It's essentially what a court does to try to help solve a problem. Number two, more importantly, what remedies are we talking about in contracts? Contract law is organized around the idea of the expectation interest. You'll see this over and over and over again. Expectation is the idea that we want to put the injured party, the non-breacher, in the economic position she would have been in if the breacher had performed. That's really the whole intuition here. That concept is set forth in a little more detail in UCC section 1305 and in restatement second section 347. So it's in the UCC for sales of goods and in the common law. I think a good way to start talk about expectation is to focus on the remedies available to a seller where the buyer has breached. Under the UCC, if we just sort of focus on a simple example involving sales of goods, you'd see that there are really three options that are available to the seller. Under 2703, the seller can attempt to resale, number one. Number two, the seller can seek damages from the buyer. Number three, in a rare case, the seller can try to recover the full contract price. We spend a few minutes unpacking those three things. They're a little trickier than they might sound. First, seller's resale. 2706 says that the seller may resell the goods, and if it does so in good faith and in a commercially reasonable manner, the seller may recover the difference between the resale price and the contract price together with any incidental damages. It's worth spending a few minutes focusing on the language of the statute. Within the words of the statute, you can find that there are lots and lots of questions or issues that might arise. So, for example, what is good faith? What does it mean for a resale to be commercially reasonable? Should the resale be a public sale or a private sale? What if the seller doesn't follow some of the rules in 2706 when it, in fact, engages in a resale? What if it turns out that the seller doesn't even try to resell? The UCC answers some of these questions, but not all of them. The last one, what if the seller doesn't resell or try to resell at all, ends up being an important question in the common law as it applies to all remedies problems, because it involves what's known as the duty to mitigate. If the buyer breaches and the seller attempts to resell, if you think about it for a minute, what the seller is doing is trying to reduce the harm caused by the breach, and this is known as mitigation. Is there a duty to mitigate? You'll see in the next week or so. The answer is, yeah, probably there is. But of course, sometimes the buyer can't, and the seller rather, can't resell, or just doesn't resell. Does that mean that the seller is automatically precluded from getting anything from the buyer? The answer is no. Under 2708, right, we find this sort of second form of remedy, damages, expectation damages, that the seller might try to recover. And that is what's known as the contract market differential. 2708 says that the measure of damages for non-acceptance or repudiation, essentially breach by the buyer, is the difference between the market price at the time and place for tender, which just means the time and place that the goods were supposed to be delivered, and the unpaid contract price, together with any incidental damages. So notice that the pattern here is the same in effect as it was in 2706. 2708 says, seller, you get the difference between what you were promised under the contract and what the market price would have been if you had resold into the market. 2706 gives the seller the difference between the contract price and what they actually got in a resale. Lots of issues here that you can imagine. What constitutes a non-acceptance? Talk about that a little bit later. How do we know what market price is? Turns out that factually that's a difficult question for courts to answer. You don't have to spend too much time worrying about it here, but be sensitive to the fact that it's a hard question to answer. What happens if the non-breacher could have resold but just didn't try? Again, that means they might have failed to satisfy their duty to mitigate, and so their damages may be reduced. Their damage recovery, rather, might be reduced because they failed to mitigate. Third, if the seller has tried to resell and they just can't because there's no market for what the buyer had agreed to buy, they might be able to recover the full contract price under 2709. We won't spend too much time on that now, but you should see that the statute tries to make it difficult for the seller to recover the full contract price in those circumstances, because if you think about it, in that situation, the seller would still have the goods. They can't resell them. Maybe they have some value and they just can't be resold. Maybe they don't. We don't really know. But what the statute is concerned about is giving the seller something greater than expectation. And that's what would happen if it turns out that the seller didn't resell and nevertheless was able to get the full contract price. They'd have both the goods and the full contract price for the goods, and that's obviously more than they expected. So what remedies are we talking about here? Expectation. And it's usually expressed as some kind of difference measure. Third, finally, why remedies? Why do we talk about these things now? If you think about it, right, you don't really even know what a contract is or what it means for a contract to have been breached, but we're starting, in a sense, at the end. Why do we do that? There are a bunch of reasons. One is that I think it really focuses your attention on what is most realistically going to be at stake in any contract problem, which is the end game. Like, is there any real value in pursuing the lawsuit for the injured party? They're not going to know the answer to that until they know whether until you know whether they're entitled to some kind of remedy, and if so, what remedy. I think it's also important to start to focus early on the idea of expectation. Expectation isn't just the sort of basic remedial point of departure in contract remedies, but I think it's a theme throughout contract law, and so we'll come back to it again and again. That's it for our introduction to remedies. We'll pick up next with Unit 2 on mitigation of damages.